This is a crash course in tools. The other videos cover each tool individually and what it does more effectively. But for those of you unfamiliar with the software and having trouble kind of locating resources, this will give you an initial introduction to tools and allow you to go to the tutors with better questions. Help is a great useful tool here. Really, if you have basic questions about tools, you should be starting here. This was going to cover most of anything you really need to know for the basic tools and Adobe software. They have an excellent resource available to you. Our resources are in-class supplements are meant just to supplement these exceptional resources provided by them and what's available from the tutors and short courses, as I repeatedly mentioned. So let's go ahead and go through some of these tools here that we do have. We have the color window. That was F6, and it has swatches with it, which we don't really use, but you may use to make your own palettes later at different times. You will need to look that up on your own because we don't really need to use that. We have the different options in the color window. So right here, there's the grayscale slider, RGB slider, HSB sliders. Those are the main three that we use. So let's go ahead and move this back. If you're interested in moving, again, go back to the Adobe page, help page. It will walk you through that process. Navigator, these are the main ones that you see me use. This is great if you're looking into a small area. We don't usually do any images that are big enough that we really need this for anything large, but you may get to that point that you want to. And then layers. So I've already named the layer. Just click on it, type your name in, and then enter. New layer is right here. So give yourself a new layer. You can change your opacity of your different layers. We'll take a look at that as we kind of move through this, maybe if we have time. So right here we start with our marquee tool. It's basically a selection tool, but it can be used for other purposes. So if we combine that with the paint bucket tool, we can kind of make rectangles or different squares. It's a little bit more functional than the shape tool, but we'll get to that in a moment. Also under the rectangle tool, and anytime you see a tool with this little kind of tick mark here, a little triangle in that bottom right corner, you can right click on that tool. Gives you an option for other tools. So in this case we'll do an ellipse and we'll fill it in, and you'll notice that it only fills it in the white area, partly with the way continuous is set up, and partly with the way some of the tolerances are, and other choices that are set up. You really need to read about the tool to kind of get a full idea of what's going on there. So let's kind of keep moving along. One thing I do want to kind of touch upon continuous, since I did bring it up. Let's go through it. So what I need to do is make a couple circles, and I'm also gonna I'll talk about move at the same time. So we'll fill in the circles. Once we deselect, Control D, select is right here. You have reselect if for some reason I didn't want to deselect, and then select deselect here. And so what you can do at this point is change the color of these with the paint bucket tool. If I have continuous checked, change this to my to a different foreground color. I can change them one at a time. Control Z for an undo there. When the continuous is checked, I can change them all at once. You can also do it by selecting to be more precise. There's a lot of options to kind of depending on how you want to go about this. Our next tool we're looking at here is another lasso tool. It's basically another selection tool. We have the initial lasso tool, which works well with pens. If you have like a Wacom tablet or something of that nature, the polygon lasso tool, which is more geometric, which may relate to our course depending on certain assignments, depending on where you're going with some things. It may be useful to you. It works in this manner. You can use it in conjunction with the move tool if you need to move things around. Also, you can then edit, copy that, move it to its own layer, and then we could change the opacity of it if you were interested in doing all those things. So that's still on the top of the other layer. So let me move it. Give me 1 second there. Deselect. And then make sure I'm on the right layer and that it's visible. And then once I move it, you can see there the transparent area. And we can up that opacity and basically fill in what we removed before. Part of why you didn't see it before is it was on top of the other one. And I didn't erase sometimes when you're copying things, you can also Control X and remove what you had before if you didn't, if you're moving things around layers. But again, this is just a general covering. Our eyedropper tool, we should be familiar with that, taking measurements, identifying colors, seeing the difference in colors. Notice how the transparency tool changes the saturation of the color. This also can allow colors, basically they mix with the background, so this is important for later on. If you're dealing with a harmony, you don't want to have colors mix on different layers and then have that create a hue outside your harmony. So that's an important idea as well. Pencil tool, brush tool, very basic tools. You can read about those as well. Don't use those too often. And in regards to the pencil tool, most of us are sticking with basic geometric designs, especially if you're watching this. The paint bucket tool we've talked about here to some degree. You can see here again the opacity is lowered, so partly why that appears that way. Make some variations very quickly with it. One thing I do want to talk about, if we go to the gradient tool, we can make a gradient across this image. Let me have to up the opacity here in a second because that's the way you'll see it. And with that, we can talk about the magic wand. And with the magic wand, you have this tolerance. So when you click on many of the words, they change and they turn into sliders themselves. Without actually seeing the slider, you have a slider there. And so this idea that tolerance basically is a range of the color. So in this case, fairly large range. We lower it down. Much smaller range, so we only get this small band. Something to explore. You can read more about that as well. Other tools, again, we don't use these too much. Some of your other drawing classes may use them depending on what they allow you to do to edit your images later. So just so you're aware of them. Typing, if you want to add labels or something to some of the images, this is where you would do it. You're changing your direction of your type, the font. Don't get too crazy with some of these. We still want to make sure it's legible, and the color, of course. But we can talk about this if there's questions about any of those. Another useful tool is a shape tool. It's been briefly introduced, so let me deselect. I will go to the swatches and pick up something. So this is the line tool. Right now I have arrows because obviously I was drawing arrows. Click on the weight here so I can change the size, make very large arrows. Have a lot of options here for the different shapes of what you want to do. You can pick the shapes here. You can pick the shapes by right-clicking down here. We talked about the polygon tool in another video just recently for basic design ideas. So if you're interested in that, you can kind of look at that. You can basically look here and kind of make a lot of different choices. Something if you want to explore, feel free to do that here. There's also a lot of custom shapes on the Adobe page. That would be another place to start. Begin looking at other ideas. One downside to shapes is you end up creating these shapes which you need to deal with them. For our purposes, we're not going to get too involved with that. I would just put them to the layer you need to. I'm going to merge them to one layer, and that way I can turn them off because I don't really, I may leave them because I may use them here in a minute. So one of the other tools that we've looked at here, we'll go to edit here in a minute. Save as has come up. Again, save for web. Save for web, the reason I don't recommend it is there's so many of these options that mistakes are easily made. If you're familiar with it, feel free to use it. File save as and JPEG at highest quality is fine for most of our purposes. But if there's questions about that, I can address those independently. Transform. There's a whole there's videos on that. There are supplemental files on that, so I'll allow those to kind of cover that. But I think it's an interesting tool, especially when you're beginning out with basic geometric designs and then taking them a step further. Your preferences, which are unfortunately a little bit off screen, this is a useful area when you start to learn to change things, especially when you start to get down to your grids and your guides and things. Right now you can see it. I have it to 1/8 subdivisions. It's 1 inch. Grid lines. You start to change your colors. This is something you'll need to read a little bit more about, but a lot of options in here that can be very important to us to use at this point. We haven't talked much about image size. Image size, one thing I would recommend is that it can change some of the edges of your color. So in this case, if we changed it to 400, it's going to basically compress this image. Not a good idea in some of the color situations that we have. So I would recommend watching the color integrity video if you have questions about that. For our purposes, we should not be using image size in general. Canvas size, it can be something if we're combining images. good to anchor something to one side. You can change it by percent. That's very useful if you're combining 3 images. You just can go by 300%. I don't want to make this image that big, so I'm going to go 150. Just add a small addition here. You can see the extra space, and we'll use our navigator to visualize that space. I'm going to close that out. Control 0 zooms into everything that can be useful to some of you at times. Image rotation, if you want to rotate everything for some reason. If you have, for example, you've created a checkerboard pattern and you want to start to rotate it, just to start to build something else off of it, this can be a good place to rotate everything rather than using transform. Layers, we've talked briefly about that. Below, what you can see is merge down, merge visible, and merge or flatten image. Merge down, merge visible can be helpful, but it's usually easier just to select the ones you want. So holding shift down, make your selections, and then merge those. So I'm going to merge layer 1. Actually, I'll hold control because I don't want layer 2, and then I'm going to merge those layers. I was thinking I would merge them all, but I need to have something separate, so I can turn them off, turn them on, use them depending on what I want to go from there. Useful, but again, reading the instructions on that will be helpful to you. You can also duplicate layers if you're doing something repetitively. Developing a design that way, that can be helpful to you as well. We don't do a whole lot with filters. You're welcome to explore them at times, but be careful with how they can be changing colors. That can be an issue in later designs. So it's good to experiment with things, but be careful on how they relate to the assignments. Most of this zoom, depending on how you're working with an image, you'll see me do a lot of changes. I typically just use zoom here just to make it simple for you to see what I'm doing when I'm working with that. Some of you may prefer the scrubby zoom. I won't do that because I found on the video it makes people feel ill, so I try to avoid using that. A lot of your choices when you pick a tool have a toolbar up here, so that's another thing to keep in mind that I don't believe I've mentioned at this time. Here are something I've been kind of advocating initially are these extras. So here is my extras. Here's my grid. Those 1/8 inch marks on the grid. So if we zoom in, so there you would see that. So 2 of these together would be 1/4 inch, 4 is 1/2 inch, and I can make kind of organize my space very quickly doing that. You can from there you can pick what you're showing. So if I want to show my grid, which I typically am showing, Smart Guide, which are those magenta lines that come up, you can pick whatever color you want for them. And I do tend to change them from time to time just to help highlight the attention. And if you want to snap things to and what you want to snap them, if you want to snap them to the grid or if you want to snap them to something else, that's also an option. But again, reading up on that, you won't typically see me use the ruler. It's not that precise of a tool. It can be good for a general reference, so feel free to look into that if you're interested as well. We've talked about windows. A lot of the tools have windows that go along with them, especially brushes. We don't do a lot with brushes because a lot of the edges on that can affect our color, which is why I don't introduce it. But if you're familiar with it, feel free to use it. I think that covers most of the basic tools that we use. I'm actually surprised it took that long. Definitely take a look at how you lay things out. Typically I will change this to where it's single bar or double, depending on what I need for video space. Lately it's been double because the images have been thinner. How you're moving some of these windows around, I mean, that can make a big difference in how you're working. If you had your own palette developed and you were using the color window, it might be appropriate if there were some small changes such as these grays and being able to identify those different grays be useful. One thing to do also is consider looking at your color wheels. I know they're not this large, but looking at them with the RGB values, the HSB values, and start to get an understanding of what's happening with those changes in color. It will make later on understanding, so you realize there's a difference here. That many of the observations are not subjective when we're talking about color, and understanding these values are kind of a first step to making that connection. That color is not usually subjective. There's usually a lot of good information that's available for us to use, and we'll continue to explore that throughout the course. But hopefully, as you get more comfortable with the tools, you can start to explore some of these layout options. They can be very helpful to you as well. I've tried to keep, when I do the videos, everything to the default I don't try to change these up too much. If you're noticing something that seems very awkward, let me know, and we can definitely discuss it. But you'll notice, around the page, there's often many options for doing the same thing. Whether we can navigate from here, whether we zoom from here. You have a lot of repetition. The transparency between the layers and for the paint bucket, that versatility, it's great with the program.